Hello and welcome back to a brand new DNF1 F1 podcast. I hope that you're all doing well and thank you once again, as always, for being here. It's great to have you along for a bit of F1 chat and discussion as we are back to review the Italian Grand Prix, and history was made. Max Verstappen, as we expected, managed to secure the perfect 10 race victories in a row. It's the first time any F1 driver in history has won 10 consecutive Grand Prix. And of course, congratulations to Red Bull as well for being the first F1 constructor to win 15 consecutive race wins. You'd have to go all the way back to Brazil last season to find a non-Red Bull winner in Formula One. This era of dominance really is unprecedented, and of course we'll talk about that in a bit more detail and how it all went down today. And joining me on this podcast to go for all of that and a little bit more is Lee Wallington on the DNF1 panel. Lee, first of all, how are you, mate? And what did you make of the Italian Grand Prix?
I'm good, thank you, Adam. I really enjoyed that race. That was a really exciting race. Obviously, we had a nice, tense battle for the lead, and it was action up and down the field. It was a really brilliant performance from all teams and drivers this weekend, and Monza delivered a really enjoyable race.
It did, and I think surprisingly so, because the ingredients were all there, you know, with respect that this was going to be a bit more of an exciting race, but I felt there was always that cork in the bottle. It was a case of how long before Max Verstappen was able to get into the lead and then run away with it, which of course he ultimately did. But throughout the Italian Grand Prix, that is usually, I think most people will forgive me for saying this, is usually known for being a race that you get a lot of DRS trains, not a lot of overtaking or too easy overtaking, if you like, and not too much excitement other than the odd occasion. I know a few years ago, of course, we had McLaren finishing 1-2 when Hamilton and Verstappen took each other out. Of course, the year before that, we had Gasly winning for the first time in his F1 career for Alpha Tauri, of course, their second victory at this circuit following Seb Vettel's back all the way in 2008. But in the past, other than those two examples, there haven't been too many exciting races to recall at the Italian Grand Prix, at least off of my memory. This one, however, despite the result being a constant that we all expected, I must say it was very, very nice to see an ongoing battle for the lead. You know, Red Bull, Max Verstappen, they had to work for it. Perez, of course, was in a great battle as well to try and get up to P2. And I think Ferrari played a huge part in that this weekend. And of course, we'll get into their weekend a little bit later on, being the home team. But the one thing that we can agree on, Lee, is this era of dominance is absolutely incredible. Of course, we'll discuss in a moment the opinion of that dominance from the sport and certain facets, whether it be the fans, the media, and other personnel as well. But one thing that we cannot deny is the inevitability and brilliance of this era of dominance we are witnessing, and we are witnessing history right now. Red Bull and Max Verstappen in particular, they are proven to be the absolute perfect combination, a 10 out of 10 performance, if you like.
It is definitely witnessing history, and you can't take anything away from the pairing of the Red Bull as a team and the driver as Max Verstappen. Obviously, the previous record of 9 wins obviously has been equalled but never beaten, and it stood for 70 years from the original record set. So, not saying Max won't increase the win streak, but this record could easily stand for another 50 years, 60 years, and may not even be beaten in our lifetime. Obviously, never say never. Know as a team can always come up with another brilliant win of rules reset, but it is an amazing achievement.
It absolutely is. And, you know, as I said, you know, everyone's having their opinion on this current era of dominance, whether you are appreciating the history that we are witnessing right before our eyes at this point in time, and perhaps won't appreciate for years to come until, you know, we get to an era, hopefully, where you'll never, ever imagine someone getting close to winning 10 races in a row, let alone actually, you know, complete that feat. I mean, it wasn't long ago that Sebastian Vettel back in 2013 did something similar and got to 9 races. And back then, that came off the back of a season where the first half of it was rather exciting. There were a lot of different winners, and then all of a sudden he just completely took off and dominated in that Red Bull. Max Verstappen, I don't know, there is this aura of inevitability about the guy. I talked about this in the last episode, and I just said, and I still feel this way, that what we are witnessing right now is absolutely incredible. And I can understand people saying, oh, well, it's easy when he has a car as dominant as what he has right now. He perhaps doesn't have the teammate to really push him like perhaps a few other drivers have had in similar positions. And you can make your mind up on that one. It's not good for the sport and stuff like that. But I think, you have to appreciate the fact that what he is doing right now is absolutely incredible. It's one thing to have a fast car and be dominant in some races. It's another thing to be able to perform with that level of consistency. And even on days like today, Lee, where he's not starting on pole position or running away from the race, there was that element of patience about Max Verstappen's performance today. Certain messages that we heard on the radio where he was talking about Carlos Sainz in particular, who was leading the race at the time, losing the back end of the car a little bit. The car was sliding. He might make a mistake. There was an element of patience that eventually he wouldn't have to force the error. It would eventually come. And then when it did, he took that opportunity and then just took off and completely controlled the race afterwards.
Yeah, obviously this is a more mature Max Verstappen compared to previous years, that he knows he's got the car underneath him. He doesn't need to pounce straight away. He can take his time because he knows he will be able to achieve his result. Obviously, Carlos did a brilliant defensive job, and after he settled in a few laps, actually, I can actually keep Max with DRS at bay. This could actually happen. And I was wondering if Max may get a bit frustrated at Carlos's defense. Obviously, there was some radio messages complaining about Carlos's defense, but still he knew it was going to come, and he kept his cool, and he did get that result.
And maturity, I think, is the right word to describe Max Verstappen, because this is a guy at the moment who, in the past, you and I that have followed his career ever since he came into Formula One, this was always a guy that was often tagged with being very impatient, very easily flustered, a guy that had a short temper, and it translated into his driving when he was getting angry. He wasn't able to wrestle a level of control and calmness in difficult situations, which would often be the detriment of his own performances. Nowadays, when he's in a position of strength like he's in right now, you could easily argue a case where these things happen like they did today with him and Carlos Sainz when they were battling, and Max would be perhaps a bit impatient and try and go for a risky move and then put himself and his opponent at risk of taking each other out and throwing away an opportunity at a great result. But that's not been the case. He has very much been much more measured. He took his time. He sensed where the weaknesses were. He knew the mistake was going to come if he just kept applying the pressure. And eventually it did. And then when it did, he took advantage of that. And I think that is one of the elements of Max's driving forte, if you like, that he has really improved upon as he's gotten older and more experienced. And I think right now, a calm and controlled and patient Max Verstappen is arguably the most dangerous version of Max Verstappen that we see at this point in time.
Yeah, it definitely is. Getting that, resolving that where you could call a weakness regarding his emotions getting to his driving ability. He's become definitely a more complete driver compared to previous years. And obviously he's stepping up into obviously becoming barring some mathematical miracle, is 3-time world champion. And he's obviously been an example to the sport right now.
Yeah. I mean, of course, we shouldn't forget there is one driver in particular that Max Verstappen is still yet to show that level of patience when fighting on equal footing with. And no prizes for guessing who we're talking about, of course, but I'm sure that will come in time, hopefully. It'd be great to see those two battling each other on track again. So we'll have to wait and see how that goes down when it comes back. But, of course, we have to look at other elements as well. And looking at this dominant period that we're experiencing with Red Bull, we know now that it could be as early as the Japanese Grand Prix that Max Verstappen is going to tie up this World Championship, so not too long at this point in time. A lot of people have had their thoughts or had a lot to say on this era of dominance right now. Some people in the media in particular have been cited to have laid a lot of praise on Max Verstappen. Admittedly, I've been one of those people that I feel like there should be an element of praise laid to Max Verstappen on how he is able to dominate, not necessarily just having the fastest car, because as we've seen from his teammate, and in other cases, some other drivers in the past when they've had dominant machinery, it's not as simple as just getting in the car, turning up on a Sunday, and then you'll win. There is an element of skill that comes with that as well. And there have been, I think we saw a few snippets as well. Lewis Hamilton was asked about this dominant era, comparing it to his own. And I think in a way you can probably argue that Lewis is probably within his rights to offer a fair opinion. He knows what it's like to have been in a dominant era himself. And he came out with a rather fiery answer saying that, regarding Valtteri Bottas, his former teammate, him and any other teammate that he has had during these dominant periods have been much more competitive and stronger than any teammate Max Verstappen has had by comparison. Citing that particular opinion, Lee, do you think that's a fair assessment from Lewis Hamilton, or perhaps are we trying to add fire to or fuel to this fire really when it's unnecessary?
Well, just as a teammate, Lewis has obviously had 3 world champions as teammates, not obviously at the same time, but through his career being obviously Jenson Button, or Fernando Alonso starting off, Jenson Button, and obviously Nico Rosberg, who obviously was world champion but then retired as soon as he was crowned, but still obviously a teammate of Lewis. So Max hasn't had another world champion in the team. That is true. But obviously you could argue from Lewis's point that his teammates have been more competitive against Lewis, because Lewis has never achieved this milestone of 10 race wins, 9 race wins. I mean, I don't know how many race wins he's had in a row. I think it's 7. It's probably the most he's had in a row.
Something like that, yeah.
And considering some of the levels of Mercedes dominance that Lewis did have in some of the most dominant Mercedes machinery, he only achieved 7. You could argue that there was that competition which Max hasn't had. However, Max has had some strong teammates. Obviously, there was a time with Daniel Ricciardo when he stepped up there. I remember at Toro Rosso against Carlos, they were quite evenly matched at their time together. So he has had very competent teammates. You may not say that's right now with Sergio. That's not saying that Sergio is not competent, but you could have a discussion on that. But it is a very mixed area on how you want to justify better teammates.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it. It's not as simple as just saying we think this one is better than this one. Although when we look at the list of teammates that both drivers have had, yeah, you can argue a case for Ricciardo definitely being up there. But I mean, if you want to compare teammates to teammates in a list of where we rank everybody, for me, you've got to look Fernando being Lewis's hardest teammate in terms of what he's achieved. But I would also argue that you could probably say Nico Rosberg has been Hamilton's hardest teammate because he actually beat him to win a world championship, and we'll always reminisce over the Rosberg-Hamilton rivalry much more than we would with the Fernando-Lewis rivalry. Obviously, both drivers were at 2 different stages of their career at the time. So, you've got those there. Button obviously belongs probably in that top 3 as well. And then that's where you fit in people like Bottas. I would put Ricciardo somewhere around that vicinity. Carlos Sainz, you can argue a case for as well, but at the same time, it was very early in both of their careers. They were a long way from the finished article. And given how far Carlos Sainz has come in his F1 career to date, I don't think many people would have predicted that Carlos Sainz would have been driving a Ferrari and fighting Max Verstappen for race victories when they were both racing out in the Toro Rosso car together, when everyone was landing a lot of expectation and potential on Max's shoulders at the time. So, you can argue a case for that to a degree. I don't think when Lewis says any teammate he's had, I feel like, well, Heikki Kovalainen is the name that comes to mind. Was Pedro De La Rosa ever a teammate of Lewis, like a temporary teammate? I feel like he might have been, but I can't remember. I know Lewis replaced Pedro De La Rosa because he was meant to drive the McLaren alongside Fernando in 2007. He was the last minute replacement. Obviously, that worked a wonder for McLaren at the time. But yeah, it's a little bit of spice, I suppose, to add to a battle that I'm sure has some more chapters to come. But of course, we have to wait for Mercedes to certainly catch up to Red Bull before we can start enjoying that battle again. But the banter, I suppose, and the little rivalry hasn't quite gone away between them two. So, as I said, guys, let us know your thoughts on this period of dominance. Is it being fairly reported across the board? I think is probably the right question. Some people feel that it's being praised too much. Some people feel like it's being scrutinised too much. I want to know your thoughts and opinions. Let me know in the comments section if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're not watching this on YouTube, of course, get over to the YouTube channel and let me know. quick one on Sergio Perez before we move on. Qualifying didn't exactly go the way that he would have wanted to, although I wouldn't say it was too bad. P5, it was very tight in qualifying. A tenth or two here, he could have easily been on the front row. But in the race, he had to be patient too. He was very much in the wars with the Ferraris today, and he eventually came out on top, albeit a little bit flustered at Carlos Sainz's driving and a bit from Charles Leclerc too. But this is more like it from Sergio Perez. This is exactly the type of performance Red Bull would want him to produce on a regular basis. And after that crash in free practice, that was definitely his mistake when he ran too wide at Parabolica. He now finds himself in a position, complementing a 1-2 on a rival's home patch, 49 points ahead of Fernando Alonso in P2. Right now, Lee, you have to look at that picture on Sunday following a difficult Friday and Saturday to a degree, and I imagine Sergio Perez would be much more relieved about his current position following the up and down form that he's been experiencing of late.
Yeah, when he was, I know it's only free practice, but when he crashed, I was like, Sergio, you were just starting to get over your rough patch. Why'd you go and stick it in the wall? Or not stick it in the wall, but have his crash. But it was for him. It was good to see that he has recovered his drive and he hasn't obviously let Friday's performance get to him. But it's definitely growing confidence in he's comfortable in the car and having the team behind him. And as you said, it's exactly what Red Bull want. They want a 1-2. They want that 1-2 in the Drivers' Championship. They want obviously in the race as well. And Sergio seems to be picking up, and as long as he can achieve that, he will quiet any calls to have him replaced.
Absolutely. The situation around him is probably, protecting him, I suppose, more than hurting him. Of course, there was a lot of emphasis on what Ricciardo's move to Alpha Tauri or return to Formula One would mean for Perez long term. Of course, his unfortunate injury has helped Perez's course inadvertently, of course. I'm sure that's not what Perez would have wanted, but at the same time, putting in a performance like he did today, following a difficult weekend up to a point, is obviously what Red Bull are going to want him to do. And that's what they will expect of him to do, especially if they have a car that's capable of winning 15 consecutive Grand Prix. They obviously want Perez to pull his weight and, deliver the results alongside his teammate. So, good result for him and good result for the team. Once again, brilliant stuff. I'm surprised the Constructors' Championship hasn't been sewn up yet. What's the gap now? 310 points to Mercedes. And it's got to be soon, surely. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, like, what is it, 43 points for a 1-2, not pole position, fastest lap is 44 points. We got 7 races left, is it, or something like that? Or 8 races. Doing the maths in my head, including the sprint races, I think they could win the Constructors' Championship in Singapore. Although it's probably more likely it will be Japan as well. So, just keeping an eye on that one. I'm sure many people listening probably aren't too interested because it's just a case of, they're going to announce it, they've won the championship. You could probably give them both trophies right now and it wouldn't make a difference to anybody, would it?
Yeah, I do think it's very likely they'll probably get both wrapped up in Japan. But yeah, as you said, it's inevitable this season regarding the performance that the team and drivers have put in together this season.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to Ferrari now. And I'm not going to lie, Lee, when I was predicting earlier in the week that Ferrari would have a strong weekend, I would have been delighted if someone had said to me that Ferrari were going to finish 3rd and 4th and be very much in the fight with Red Bull, perhaps to get another car on the podium or even try and win the race, although that looked very unlikely once Max eventually got into the lead. But Carlos Sainz, Charles Leclerc, it was a bit dicey at the end, a bit scary, I suppose, for the Tifosi on looking when they were fighting amongst each other, but P3 for Carlos Sainz, complementing a very impressive pole position for Ferrari on home turf. Charles Leclerc, of course, just missed out on the front row, but managed to finish P4. Thoroughly enjoying the performance and enjoying the race, by his own words. He said he was much happier finishing P4 under these conditions rather than it being a boring race. Got to say, hats off to Ferrari. I think more than anything else, it was very much them that made this race weekend much more exciting, perhaps, than we were expecting.
Yeah, Ferrari obviously had a very good weekend in general. Admittedly, they performed better than I expected them to this weekend, but as you said, they're the ones that made this weekend. I think we'd have been looking at a very different Sunday if Max had stuck it on pole. And probably disappeared. But Carlos's brilliant driving and Max is obviously brilliant driving to put the pressure on Carlos. We gave us a very interesting race between the two of them, and obviously as Sergio came through. But I was concerned a little bit with Ferrari that they didn't tell them to hold station at the home Grand Prix when the drivers were fighting each other. I was really concerned that they were going to end up taking each other out, which would have been typical Ferrari, unfortunately, if that had happened. But
it would have been the most Ferrari thing ever.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really would have been. If Charles Leclerc on that final lunge into turn one where he locked his brakes and changed direction. I'm not going to lie, Lee, I was thinking very much what happened in Baku in 2018 with Ricciardo and Verstappen when they took each other out there. I was thinking, surely not here. I mean, I'll be brutally honest. I said this before we started recording, but if those two had taken each other out in that moment, I'm pretty sure that Ferrari would have had a public resignation signing from both of their drivers. Never mind the contract sagas that we're hearing with both drivers. I'm pretty certain that they would not have been very welcome by the Tifosi if that had gone horribly wrong. As it was, though, they managed to get that result. Carlos Sainz on the podium. I think the first podium he's had at Monza for Ferrari. I know he's been on the podium before with McLaren a couple of years ago, back in 2020. So a lovely moment for Carlos Sainz. And of course, getting pole position as well. That will be not as good as winning on the Sunday, but I'm pretty sure he'll be pretty happy with how his weekend went.
Yeah, I think overall he had a very good weekend, and of course he can be happy. Obviously, there's the internal politics regarding Ferrari about who's number one, who's the star boy, which we know is Charles, but Carlos is obviously making a very good case that they should be equal. Although Ferrari right now probably say they are equal. We know their preferred driver is still Charles, but Carlos is a very capable driver, and he's obviously making his case of why he should be in the team.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the head-to-heads for the races this season, they're 7 apiece, Sainz and Leclerc. So, you know, we talk about Charles Leclerc as like having the highest ceiling between the two, but usually we saw this season, we saw a lot of it in 2021, when Ferrari have a car that's not really good, it does tend to expose Leclerc's mistakes more than it does Carlos Sainz. And I think you can argue the other way, where when Ferrari have a competitive car, we start to see Carlos Sainz struggle a little bit, not necessarily because he's not good, but more to the fact that Leclerc just has a higher ceiling or ultimate pace than his teammate. And I don't think many people would argue that. But you do get that consistency from Carlos Sainz, and it's also why he's currently ahead of his teammate in the Drivers' Championship. Very evenly balanced from Ferrari now, and Ferrari up into P3 in the Constructors' Championship. They've finally overtaken Aston Martin. Even though this race served as a bit of a one-off, I suppose, compared to some other races we've got coming up, and Ferrari needed to take advantage on home soil where the track characteristics really did suit their car compared to some others. Is P3 enough for this season, Lee, based on where they are, or do they need to set their sights on trying to overhaul Mercedes, who, you know, some weeks they're very, very good, but also some weeks they're not great either? It seems to be that merry-go-round in that chasing pack.
Obviously, Ferrari need to set their sights on Mercedes. If they reach Mercedes is a different matter, but they should set their sight on Mercedes. The main thing is they've overhauled Aston Martin. Obviously, that was not to do any disservice to Aston Martin, but that was the embarrassment being behind the midfield team. They got ahead of the midfield team. They're now in the top 3. Well, obviously, they don't want to be third. They want to be number 1. But they don't want to be behind the midfield team. So they've cleared that. And now I think they should obviously set their sights on trying to close that gap to Mercedes.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's something that we expected. And of course, when we talk about Aston Martin, we'll probably go into a bit more detail as to why we expect Ferrari to eventually overhaul Aston Martin, or probably say, you know, it should have happened sooner than it has, but it has now happened. And I imagine that will most likely continue for the remainder of the season. But, you know, some of the driving on display today, Ferrari from a defensive perspective, you know, Max Verstappen and Checo Perez were having complaints about particularly Carlos Sainz moving a bit aggressively with these defensive manoeuvres. Charles Leclerc, I think there was a moment where he was pushing Perez quite to the limit at the second chicane. What did you make of that, Lee? Was that on the limit, or do you think perhaps Ferrari were a little bit naughty, their drivers, with some of their defensive tactics today?
Firstly, I think it was very good defensive driving. Obviously, there'd been looking at Fernando Alonso in regarding his defensive driving.
Yeah.
It was probably on a bit of a limit on some of the moves. There was a bit, not every lap, but there were occasionally a very late second. Well, it's not a second move because that's obviously illegal, but there was a late move to take the line into the racing line into the corner, which wasn't very nice, but yeah, there was very fine. It could have gone either way regarding, I think, with the stewards of how they felt it. But it was a very good job in the that's defensive driving. Get the right terminology there. And I really thought the DRS, the Red Bulls, were breeze past those Ferraris, but they did really good job at holding them back. It obviously did happen, but that was some very good driving from both of their Ferrari drivers today.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is Ferrari had to make Red Bull work for it today.
Yeah.
I think we can all agree that Red Bull certainly didn't breeze to victory. I mean, they got into that position, they were comfortable, but they certainly had to earn the 1-2 today. So that was always good to see. I agree. I think there were a few moments where I thought perhaps is getting away with a little bit under the circumstances. I think that one you mentioned in particular, that Checo was complaining about Carlos moving under braking. Now, of course, we both know that's an illegal move and would be penalised. But I think we can both agree, Carlos, he left it as late as possible to make that move. It was a little bit sketchy, but he wasn't moving under braking. We can agree on that much. If he was, obviously that's a different issue altogether. But a great job from Ferrari, and of course they will hope that this is the start of an upturn in form for them, where maybe they could catch Mercedes. I would say probably not likely. I think Mercedes all round have a much better car at the circuits that are remaining, and their two drivers are still getting good performances on difficult weekends, and we saw that again today with Mercedes. But you never know with Ferrari, they could surprise us. Hopefully they do. And I'm not just speaking for myself here, of course. I'm a very happy Tifosi member after what I've seen this weekend. Moving on to Mercedes, of course, Lee. This was always going to be a weekend where we expected Mercedes to really struggle, and it was very much damage limitation. As it were, George Russell, after a very good qualifying performance, getting on the second row of the grid, solidified that with a P5, albeit it wasn't without a few errors, but I think we can agree, given how well he drove on Saturday and Sunday, I think he very much made up and compensated for those issues, and he was able to get some good points on the board. Lewis Hamilton, of course, didn't have the best qualifying session. I think he was, P8 or something like that. Not the best start on the alternate strategy, and also had a few naughty moments himself, but managed to recover and finish P6. And I think this pretty much sums up Mercedes' season, where they've been strong where they have been strong, but their drivers have been very good at pulling out some points when they have been up against it. And I think we can agree Mercedes were up against it this weekend, but they will probably bit your hand off for a P5 and a P6 this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, on Friday, Mercedes looked nowhere, but that's very much Mercedes of extracting every little bit out of a weekend where they appear to be nowhere. And the Mercedes are, again, a perfect example of damage limitation. Obviously, both drivers got a 5-second penalty, but they managed to obviously keep their positions by the end of the race. But as we've said before, as a driver pairing, they're probably the best up there because their level of consistency, although Lewis seems to be more comfortable ahead of George in regarding the point situation and performances, they're still very consistent and extracting the best points available every weekend between the two of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we were concerned about George Russell's form of late, but I've got to say, despite a difficult Friday and Saturday morning, he completely flipped everything around and managed to put it together in qualifying. And it set him up really well in the race. I mean, Hamilton didn't have the best qualifying session, admittedly, although we did expect Mercedes to struggle. I don't think any of us would have predicted Mercedes to be on the front two rows of the grid, let alone beat a Red Bull, for example, which is what George Russell did. But both drivers getting some penalties for some incidents on track. Obviously, George Russell cutting the corner to pass, lapping one of the Alpines, I think it was, on pit lane exit, I think, if I remember that rightly, which caused him a 5-second penalty, although it didn't really matter to his race result. Hamilton, of course, having that incident where he squeezed Oscar Piastri too much and caused an incident there. Hamilton, by his own admission, admitted it was his fault and he'd already apologised for Oscar Piastri. What were your thoughts on that incident, Lee?
It was clearly it was Lewis squeezing Oscar in that situation, but he held his hands up and said, "Sorry, that I completely misjudged the spacing." And he went and spoken to Oscar, and I think it's the right thing to do, and to discuss that between the drivers.
Yeah, I mean, Oscar Piastri was unfortunate again because, you can argue that he's been a victim of two occasions where he's been squeezed in a difficult position. I think, unlike the one at Belgium, I think we can argue there's absolutely nothing that Oscar Piastri did that he shouldn't have done in that position. He was certainly where he should have been to try and defend with Hamilton, but just got squeezed a bit too much, unfortunately. So, very unfortunate for him and for McLaren, but unfortunately, that's racing sometimes. That thing can happen to anybody. We've got to pay homage as well, I suppose, to Mercedes on the strategy side, because I don't think that gets highlighted a lot this season, that it's very easy for us to lay criticism at them over what happened at Zandvoort when they didn't really react quick enough, or they're a bit conservative on their strategy, and it cost them. They could have done a bit better. But particularly with Hamilton, putting him on the hard tyres to start the race with, and he was worried about the tyre wear because the track was a lot hotter and complaining about the degradation. And Mercedes put him onto the mediums at the halfway point and obviously had some room to try and fix things. The way the race panned out, I think it's fair to say, Lee, that if Mercedes went with the strategy everybody else did in the race, going mediums to hards rather than hards to mediums, I don't think Hamilton passes Albon or the two McLarens, in all honesty. So we got to lay some praise to the team for being able to give him that strategy to take him out of a difficult position, even though maybe even Hamilton himself wasn't a believer that this would work until eventually it got him up into P6.
Yeah, I mean, he was voicing his concerns throughout the race that it was the wrong tyre strategy. He was struggling on the hards. He was concerned the mediums wouldn't last. Clearly, the mediums did last, and he did come alive on those mediums compared to his stint on the hard. But it was Mercedes aren't always the best at strategy when it compared to like Red Bull, for example. But they did a very good strategy to help Lewis improve from his qualifying position.
Yeah, very, very much so. Speaking of Mercedes, Courtney, even though he's not on the episode tonight, he's actually just forwarded us an interesting quote from Toto Wolff regarding the Max Verstappen dominance. So we're going to feed this argument with another opinion from Toto Wolff. And I'm going to read a quote that from Sky Sports F1. So if it looks like I'm reading off my phone, that's exactly what I'm doing. And he says, our situation was maybe a little different because we had two guys fighting against each other within the team. I don't know whether he, Max Verstappen, cares about the record. It's not something that would be important for me or any of those regarding any of those numbers. It's for Wikipedia. Nobody reads that anyway. So, I mean, I read Wikipedia sometimes because I like a good giggle sometimes to see how creative people can be when they change stuff on Wikipedia. But I mean, what do you make of that, Lee? Toto Wolff, again, another perspective citing that Red Bull very much prioritise an out-and-out number one and a number two that can't really challenge him, rather than having two drivers competitive on equal footing. Would you agree with that from Toto Wolff? What are your thoughts?
Well, the first part of if Max cares about the record, obviously, Max has never talked about records to the same degree that Sebastian did. Sebastian loved records, loved his Formula One history. I'm not aware of Max's knowledge of the sport regarding historical the sport. Obviously, he knows the sport. He's a driver in it. So I'm just using Sebastian as a reference because obviously another successful Red Bull driver. So on the regarding the records, I can't have an opinion about Max if he knows or cares about the record he's achieved today. But the actual of having number one and number two, obviously Red Bull haven't said anything publicly that Max is number one, but we know he is. Again, using Sebastian as a reference point, they made it very clear that Sebastian was the number one compared to Mark Webber in their time together. So we know Red Bull have a historical trend to have a number one and a number two, even when you could argue for the time Mark and Sebastian were teammates. Mark did give Sebastian, especially two particular seasons, a good run for his money, but he was still number two.
Well, 2012, he was leading the championship up until Korea, wasn't it? And
was it 2010?
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
That was 2010. 2012 was Fernando, was giving him a run for the money from the Ferrari.
Pain. Too much pain.
But Mark was a lot closer to Sebastian than Sergio is. That's just the numbers and the points. You can't argue that one. But having an out-and-out number 1 and 2, obviously it's not being publicised. Red Bull haven't said Max is, but it does look like he is number 1. He gets preferential treatment more often than not, but he's the one bringing the results. You can only give preferential treatment if one of you is going to be one bringing results. If Sergio was out and out fighting Max every weekend and he wanted preferential treatment, then he could have reason to justify it. At the moment, he can't, because he's not fighting Max, and that's really just the points speak for themselves on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I like Toto Wolff, but I get the point he's trying to make. I do think it's probably a quote that is probably said with a bit of a sour taste in his mouth over what's going on, and I can totally understand. I'm not going to say, it's just sour grapes and Toto Wolff's having a whinge, but I mean, there is an element to that there if you like, but I do feel that... I mean, this is the guy, bear in mind, Lee, this is the guy, when he talks about dominant periods and having two drivers fighting on level playing field, this is the guy that referred to Bottas as the perfect wingman. And this was at the height of Hamilton's dominant period. It was in one race when he said it, the Hungarian race, where, he was helping... was it Russia? No, it was Russia, wasn't it? Where Bottas was winning and James Vowles on the radio told him, the famous radio message, asking him to move out of the way for Lewis for the championship. And I think, Toto referred to him afterwards as the perfect wingman. So... I get the point. Mercedes, yes, they've had more competitive lineups, I suppose, than Red Bull in the Max Verstappen era, at least. Rosberg, Hamilton being the obvious example. There certainly wasn't any preferential treatment there. They had to divide the garage into two parts so that to keep the two away from each other and keep the two teams away from each other within that super team they had. But... in the period after that, it was very much Hamilton number 1 and Bottas number 2. I don't think anyone could argue that those two were on equal footing. Maybe Bottas believed they should be, but we saw evidently Hamilton was the guy getting the results, like Max is now to a degree. I think it's a lot closer and a bit more even now with Hamilton and Russell, but I think that's more out of... it's not necessarily out of desire. I think that's just the position they have to be in, because Hamilton and Russell at this point in talking have now signed 2-year deals. And Mercedes will want Russell to have level or an equal amount of influence as Hamilton, because they will want him to supersede Hamilton and be the future of their team. And it's up to Russell to justify that faith and make sure that he actually does deliver on that. But at the same time, you have a driver in Hamilton who is still proven to be invaluable. So you can't throw him to the wayside because he is still outperforming his teammate more often than not. So... that's the dynamic Mercedes find themselves in. Certainly not by design. It's just where they've ended up under the circumstances. So, interesting comments from Toto Wolff. Not sure I'm utterly convinced that there is an immediate contrast between the two. I think there are a lot of similarities between those dominant eras. But that's one for the comment section, I think. Let me know, guys. Get in the comment section. You've been brilliant and been very active. And I want to hear more or see more engagement from you guys on some of these topics as well. So do let me know. Let's move on, Lee. As much as I'd like to talk a bit more about the contract stuff with Hamilton and Russell, obviously our thoughts on that one. But it is good news all around for Formula One, especially for Mercedes as well, that they're both staying with the team for the next couple of years. Let's talk about Alex Albon. Alex Albon, we have to talk about him. I mean, this guy is absolutely brilliant right now for Formula One, and I'm loving what he's doing. That Williams was as wide as 2 London buses back-to-back at rush hour traffic. And another great performance, a solid P7. He would have absolutely frustrated all those around him. Big points for Williams in the Constructors standing as well. What's not to like right now?
Yeah, I mean, with Williams and Alex especially, you're right. You could say that apart from Max, they're the only driver and team that's in pure harmony. Williams and Alex are just working. It's just a dream team for this dream scenario for them right now. Yes, they're not fighting for championships, not fighting for wins, but they're so in sync together between the two of them, and it's great to see Williams being towards the sharp end after the few years in the back of the grid. And Alex is just doing an amazing performance. It's a very fast roadblock today, but a very well deserved rule to hold on. Obviously, Lewis did get past, but to hold on the fast McLarens, the Fernando chasing it down as well. and having all that pressure behind him for lap after lap. Brilliant job by Alex today.
Do you know, it's nice that we see one of these scenarios where one of the lesser teams in the sport, in terms of raw pace at this point in time, that Williams are, you know, you don't often see a team have an obvious strength like the straight line speed that Williams have, and it serves them really well on a track like this, and obviously to defend as well in the high speed sections. You never see a team try and employ that tactic and expect it to work. But this weekend, we saw that with Alex Albon, as we did in Belgium. You know, they have these strengths, they have these advantages, they have a nice balance about them now. I don't think we can just refer to them as just straight line speed merchants, although admittedly this weekend that was certainly a trait that was going to help them. But they pulled it off really well. McLaren were putting a lot of pressure on them. Obviously Hamilton was putting pressure on them, and I think the tyre advantage that Lewis had ultimately proved to be the difference between the two. I think if it wasn't for that, Albon may have had him as well. But to see him pull that off and get some good points for Williams, you know, a year after that incredible performance that Nick De Vries put in the Williams for Williams, in similar circumstances as well, it's really good for Formula One to have other stories like that to enjoy. And I think it further cements not only the progress and the rise that Williams are experiencing at this point in time, but also the fact that Alex Albon is very much becoming a driver that a lot of teams are keeping tabs on, because he is very much announcing himself on the F1 stage as well at the sharper end.
Yeah, he's part of that new generation come through. He's obviously had a few rougher years in when he was part of the Red Bull family, but obviously he's just finding himself in Williams, being the team leader, building that team around him as the team builds up from the back of the grid. It's just working in harmony right now, and it's really great to see them working together brilliantly, and seeing Alex do the performances that we know he can do. And I mean, I'm not going to lie, we're seeing Williams up again. We have obviously not been the sharp end of the grid just yet, but fighting for the points on a regular basis, it is really nice to see.
Yeah, really good stuff indeed. Word on Logan Sargeant, of course, in qualifying, it did look promising at first, but he wasn't able to get out of Q2, which set him back. Had a pretty decent race, I think, all things considered. We didn't see too much of him, but he managed to finish in P11, just outside the points. I think it was about 5 seconds off of Bottas in the end, who got the last championship point. But a much better performance from Logan Sargeant. Even though he didn't get some points, I think Williams would be much happier that he was a little bit closer to his teammate than he has been for some time, albeit still about 25 seconds off the pace.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of pressure on Logan right now regarding if he's going to be keeping his seat long term. So a performance today, although it was outside the points, it starts to build his case why he should remain in the sport.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the jury's obviously going to be out on him until the rest of the season, but maybe a points finish here or there will certainly help his cause. He certainly looks like he's getting a bit closer and he's starting to improve a bit more. So hopefully for his sake, that will continue. Let's move on to McLaren. As we said already, Lee, going into the summer break, McLaren would have been on an absolute high and probably had their sights set on maybe a top 3 finish in the Constructors' Championship. Difficult couple of weeks, another difficult weekend for them. Some bad luck, of course, that came with Oscar Piastri losing out in the incident with Lewis Hamilton later on in the race. But as it stands right now, Lee, after the upgrades that they brought onto their car, I think it was like 6 different upgrades they bought. It was a huge raft of them. They're currently sitting 102 points off Aston Martin in 4th and now 113 off Ferrari in P3. I don't know about you, but that is a huge mountain to climb, even though McLaren are looking better. But the last couple of races, it's not really gone their way, has it?
The races haven't gone their way, as you said. But all they need is 1 or 2 good results like they did before the summer break. And Aston Martin or Ferrari more Aston Martin than Ferrari to be on the bottom end of the points or out of the points altogether. And that gap could easily close. At the same time, it could easily expand. There is obviously a nice buffer for Aston Martin, but McLaren will be at the very least aiming to overhaul that gap with Aston Martin.
Yeah, and this is a team as well that has an interesting inter-team dynamic as well. We saw a few moments on the team radio where Norris was complaining that Oscar was not going quick enough and perhaps slowing him up. Then, of course, there was that moment after Piastri's pit stop where Lando had undercut him, gone round the outside, and the two had touched. Fortunately, there was no damage as they touched wheels. But seems to be a bit of a metal there, perhaps forming between these two. Obviously, Piastri's up in his game now, and obviously is laying a claim to a bit more supremacy at McLaren. Could you see that one getting a bit more tense as the races go on? There's a good relationship, of course, but Norris and Piastri do seem to find each other on the same pieces of track more often than not now, and that may create opportunity for a bit of drama there.
Well, firstly, when drivers find themselves, drivers from the same team find themselves on the same piece of track, it normally means they're extracting the most out of the car to be in the same piece of track. So between the two of them, you could say they're quite evenly matched because they always seem to be there or thereabouts, which is obviously good for McLaren in one sense, not when they come out and potentially clash going into turn one. But the rivalry, it can push them to great new heights. Obviously, Oscar's still a rookie. He's in his rookie season. He's still learning and he will only get better. But at the same time, if he's pushing Lando along and Lando's pushing Oscar along, it could really just push McLaren to greater highs in the coming seasons.
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, McLaren will hope that those two are able to keep it amicable at the moment. I'm not suggesting that it's not, of course, but they seem to have a very good relationship, those two. There's a very hilarious interview between the two where I think Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri were talking about their partners. Piastri said that his girlfriend loves pineapple on pizza, and Lando Norris responded saying, "You should dump her. Like, this is disgraceful." And I'm sure many Italians out there that love their pizza will know exactly what I'm talking about, and probably side with Lando on that one. All jokes aside, of course. But yeah, interesting stuff. It's good to see those two really getting the most out of the car. But McLaren, of course, they will need perhaps another surge of good form if they're going to get themselves back in this fight in the Constructors' Championship. Speaking of which, let's move on to Aston Martin now, Lee. And Fernando Alonso, it was a relatively quiet performance from Fernando this weekend. Wasn't really a lot to go on to say Fernando is absolutely extracting everything out of this car and doing Fernando things. Although I do think he probably was to a certain degree. But it was only good enough for P9. And even then, that was mostly inherited because of what happened with Piastri and the McLaren. And Stroll, you'd be forgiven for thinking Lance Stroll wasn't even in the race. I hardly ever saw him at all. And he was as low down as 14th. Started the race dead last, of course, after a dismal qualifying. We are very much in a situation right now, Lee, where people talk about one driver carrying a team. I don't think there's any team on the grid right now that relies on one driver as much as Aston Martin is relying on Fernando Alonso at the moment.
Oh yeah, I mean, if there was two Lance Strolls in Aston Martin, there'd be nowhere this season. I don't know how many points Lance has off the top of my head.
Well, points-wise, they'd be fighting Alpine for P6. P would be effectively P5 at this point. But there you go. That is literally the difference between the two. Like, Ferrari have only just overtaken Aston Martin because of how good Alonso has been. And you could argue, Lee, as well, just to add to your point, that if Aston Martin had a decent driver in their car or similar quality to Alonso or just a little bit off, perhaps maybe someone like an Oscar Piastri, for example, they'd probably be second still in this Constructors' Championship. I mean, they've got 6 podiums. Fernando's got them all. Ferrari have only got 4. And for as dismal as Ferrari have been at times, they've still found a way to overhaul them eventually. So the gulf between the two drivers, it couldn't be larger at the moment.
Yeah, they're obviously irritated at a point when obviously Mercedes, Ferrari, and to a degree McLaren are come for Aston Martin since the start of the season. And when Aston Martin had the advantage, they weren't maximising it because both their drivers weren't maximising the points available from the car's performance. So there is a lot of probably a lot of pressure on Lance's shoulders right now.
I mean, is it as simple as saying that Lance Stroll is just not that good of a driver, or is it something more fundamental at Aston Martin, where Fernando, as brilliant as he is, has had a history of being able to drive around a car's problems, providing they're not as bad as the GP2 engine stuff at McLaren, for example, or is it just a case of Lance is just not good enough?
I think it's probably a mix of Fernando driving brilliantly and over delivering what the car can realistically achieve. Probably also a bit that Lance has always been question marks regarding his ability in Formula One. Obviously, he's had some brilliant performances, and that's been wow. Where did that come from? But also been he's just the most successful, well, not most successful in points, but the best paid driver in Formula One history because he's got a team. Instead of just high sponsorship, he owns the team effectively through his dad. Well, his dad owns the team, but you get the point. And it's a real probably a mix of between the two regarding that. And the third point may be that Fernando's come in and completely disrupted Lance's rhythm. Obviously, Lance has been either equal teammates or he's been the team leader. You go back to Sebastian, he completely had Sebastian under control in their time together as teammates. And Fernando's come in and he completely just ruined Lance's equilibrium and confidence in himself and in the team, which is another point of it's probably a combination of all three.
Yeah, because I mean, we looked at Aston Martin, and as great as they were at the start of the season, I think it's probably fair to say that the performance has winded away over the course of the season so far, and it's not exactly gone the way they would have wanted in terms of keeping that up. The podium at Zandvoort, as impressive a drive as it was from Fernando, I don't think many of us would have predicted Aston Martin to have been in that picture if it wasn't for the conditions changing the way they were and the way Fernando was driving. So I wonder if there is something else at Aston Martin with this car that we're not really seeing so much because Fernando is as good as he is and he's able to drive around these issues and still pick up some results. And Lance was struggling at the start of the season, we know, because of the injury, and he's still struggling now. So it's hard to pinpoint where the actual issue is. If it's just one thing, it may be a combination of many different things, but right now, I do wonder if Aston Martin have to start really having this serious conversation about Lance Stroll, because I've tried to defend the guy, and people that listen to this show will say, there have been occasions where I probably defended him where it wasn't warranted, but we're at this point now where Aston Martin are growing in expectation. They are growing in stature. The facilities are getting better. The team is getting better. The car is getting faster. The drivers have to match that. And at the moment, they've got one that is, and they know what an elite level driver looks like because they have one at the moment. And the other one, even though he's the boss's son, he's not able to deliver on that. And it gets to a point where you feel like someone has to be ruthless. Maybe Lawrence Stroll has to be that ruthless guy and make a very difficult decision.
Yeah, and to further add to that point, obviously not for a couple more seasons, but they will obviously be a constructors works team with Honda coming on in a couple of seasons, and then that's another pressure on the team regarding obviously stakeholders, not just within Aston Martin, but as their partner company with Honda, and the expectation that Honda will come into that will already building behind the team, behind the scenes, I should say. Obviously, some rumors are that Honda are wanting to get Yuki Tsunoda in to Aston Martin to obviously be their Japanese driver and the Japanese works team for Honda, and that's probably going to be rumbling on for a while in the background. If it's true, I'm not saying it is, but there are growing rumors on that Honda are pushing for that.
It's not a bad acquisition, to be honest, but you got to try and sell it to the boss, and I'm not sure whether or not he'd be keen to entertain those thoughts at the moment. But we know Aston Martin are retaining Lance Stroll for next season. They've been very outspoken about that. But of course, the closer we get to 2026, when this Aston Martin project will start to really have some force behind it, with the mighty Honda powering it, we'll have to wait and see if Aston Martin are quite keen to retain Lance's services if he's still driving there. We know Fernando will be because the guy's evergreen. So each to their own on that one. But moving on to another topic, Alfa Romeo getting back in the points again. Valtteri Bottas finishing P10th. I'll tell you what, Lee, they should have got points alone for how beautiful that livery looked. But it's such a shame we didn't see too much of Bottas or even Zhou this weekend. But yet Bottas shows up in the points to everybody's surprise.
Yeah, it was such a beautiful livery. I mean, we were saying in the preview about the curse of special edition liveries, but Ferrari and Alfa Romeo proved us wrong this weekend. But obviously, different areas of the grid, but brilliant results for Bottas. So Courtney has been quite vocal about Valtteri being on holiday and off skinny dipping or in the sauna, but he turned up in the heat of Monza today and brought back some needed point. I'll say point, so but it's a point.
Maybe that's what he did. He had to shed some weight. He just drove naked. Maybe he did. We didn't notice it because we hardly saw Bottas on the broadcast today. So for all I know, he could have been bare butt naked and drove around that circuit, put a bucket hat on, looking as cool as he does, and pick up the points. I'm not condoning that, but maybe that is the way forward for Alfa Romeo to get some more points here.
Yeah, well, I'm sure he wasn't naked. I'm sure the FA has some rules regarding what they have to wear, i.e. their race suit in the car.
Well, I mean, we'll see Bottas put some photos on his Instagram or Twitter if he has done. Interesting moment to start the race. Obviously, we had the start aborted because of what happened with Tsunoda breaking down before the start. And there was that moment whilst everybody was waiting, the mechanics were at the edge of the pit lane, waiting to get access to the grid while the cars were switched off so that they could abort the start, delay it, and then service the cars as they needed to. I don't know if you saw, the two Alfa Romeo mechanics were climbing over the gate that was meant to be closed to stand on the grid, and standing there awkwardly probably influenced the FIA to actually, get involved and stop this. Are you surprised we didn't hear any potential reprimands or steward's inquiry regarding that? Because I thought Alfa Romeo might get a bit in trouble for that.
Immediately, I thought they were going to get in trouble for that. I think there would be a fine or something coming Alfa Romeo's way because they're very stringent about not having any engineers on the grid. Obviously, in a normal starting procedure, if there's a mechanic is on the car 1 second too long, that's obviously the team gets penalised. So just standing on the grid when the fans don't actually know what's going on, because the teams were informed, but the fans weren't informed of anything for like 20 minutes after the supposed restart. The cars were just sitting there. Is it a red flag? Is the race start being delayed? There was no communication. It was a utter mess. And then they're like, "Oh, the race has been restart will be delayed and commence at 25 past the hour." But it was just a mess, and I think the FA could have handled that better.
Yeah, we have seen a few instances this season where I think a lack of communication has been a bit of an issue, and unfortunately, when the stewards or the FIA are usually approached for comment on these issues, they often say that they're quite calculated reasons, like when Lance Stroll crashed in Belgian qualifying when it was still a wet track. The reason why they didn't want to they didn't put communications as whether or not the track was wet or dry or not was because they didn't want people going on to different compound of tyres against, the tyre rules that they had for qualifying because it was a sprint weekend and stuff like that. Could have let people know. It was a bit silly. And then we had the stuff today where people were saying where they're going to red flag it, where's the communication. I think the logic behind it, not that the stewards came out with anything, was that if they'd have red flagged it before the race had even started, it would have presented an opportunity perhaps for teams to alternate their strategies. Like, for example, Hamilton was on hard tyres. He could have gone medium because he already had the hards on. He wouldn't have had to make that mandatory pit stop. Probably wouldn't have worked because of the tyre deg on this circuit. So, with hindsight, it turned out to be the right decision. But a lack of communication from the stewards and the FIA, obviously annoying some F1 fans, admittedly, and totally understandable. But crazy scenario, but fortunately, it wasn't too much of an issue. Quick one on Alfa Romeo and the Constructors League. We haven't talked about them too much, but currently a point behind Haas, who, again, today, Haas were definitely the slowest of everybody. Magnussen and Hülkenberg finishing dead last of the runners. I think the only time we really saw much of Haas today was when Magnussen was following the two Ferraris in the closing stages of the races. So plenty to play for between them two. And as I said, a point here or there like we got with Bottas today, and Haas don't pick up their game, it could very much mean the difference between earning extra millions of dollars in prize money and having to struggle financially for a little while after that if you're not successful.
Yeah, I mean, for the teams towards the back, or any team, but especially with teams towards the back, those 1 or 2 points is life-changing. Yes, so teams may be operating at the cost cap or towards the cost cap, but it definitely helps if you get prize money and not relying on internal funds or sponsorship to get that revenue. So I'm sure Alfa Romeo will be trying their hardest to get that 2 points to overhaul Haas.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to another section of the show. A bit later than usual, but given who it's related to, I'm sure you'll probably understand why. But Lee, Who is making your sympathy pit lane this weekend?
So my sympathy pit lane is Yuki Tsunoda. Obviously had a brilliant qualifying, but didn't get to do any racing laps due to pulling over on the formation lap, which is for a race driver, is a very boring way to go out. You don't even get to race a DNS, especially after you've done the hard work done a lot of hard work on the weekend to qualify as well as he did. I think he qualified at P11. So it was a great place to start the race, and he just didn't get to have some fun. He just got his shotgun in the pickup truck and off he went.
Yeah, that's about as exciting as it got for him to climb into the big lorry, which, for Yuki, that might be a bit more exciting than for others. But, yeah, very unfortunate for him. And he's been driving very, very well, Yuki Tsunoda. This season, I think, has been a very strange story for Yuki Tsunoda. I think he's the first driver to have 3 teammates in the same season. Since, what was it? Was it Kimi Raikkonen back in 2009? I believe it was Massa, then Luca Badoer, and then Giancarlo Fisichella, of course, in the Ferrari that season. So a lot of comparisons have been made with Yuki Tsunoda, but I think one thing that we can all agree on is that Yuki has very much shined in a very, very troublesome car. And he did it again in qualifying. Qualified P11. Both AlphaTauris did very well, of course. Liam Lawson P12 alongside him. Only a tenth and a half off him, which I think if he's a tenth and a half off Yuki Tsunoda at most races this season, I think that would be a very good job and good result for Liam Lawson. But for Yuki, yeah, unfortunate once again. Reliability really getting the best of him. Obviously, Red Bull were a bit concerned because they use the same power units as AlphaTauri do, so they're obviously having a watchful eye on that. But as I said, for AlphaTauri this season, it pretty much has been the story of their season with everything that's gone on. When you lay it all out there, it probably doesn't surprise you that they are dead last in the Constructors' Championship, doesn't it?
No, it's obviously for the Red Bull family, which obviously AlphaTauri is part of the Red Bull family. It is obviously disappointing for their sister team to be at the back and the grid in a Red Bull sandwich or a Red Bull family sandwich. Obviously, AlphaTauri made a big deal about going their own way as a constructor, and it's not really worked for them. Obviously, they had a disappointing performance of Nick De Vries. And yeah, the 3 teammates. But we said Yuki had to step up this season at the beginning of the season, and he has stepped up, and he's done a lot of hard work. It's just not been in point scoring positions, mostly P11s.
Absolutely, and hopefully he will be in better machinery in years to come, and he will be able to put together those performances that he has been doing, but in much faster machinery, and hopefully get some bigger points. Certainly deserves a break this season, but unfortunately it hasn't quite happened for him outside of what he's capable of. Liam Lawson, of course, we should talk about him. His second race for the AlphaTauri team. We're stepping in for Daniel Ricciardo, who's still off injured at the moment, and hopefully his recovery is going rather well. We'd have been gutted to have missed this race with his Italian heritage, of course. But Liam Lawson, he had a decent weekend where he was learning a lot in Zandvoort. This weekend, obviously, he had a bit more experience under his belt. Qualified P12, finished P13 on a track that we expected AlphaTauri to not be strong at. Gotta say, Lee, even if Liam Lawson is not firmly in the picture for that seat next season, I think he's doing everything he possibly can to argue his case. And if I was Red Bull looking at this and thinking who to partner Tsunoda next year, I don't think I could rule Liam Lawson out right now.
I wouldn't rule Liam Lawson out right now. Obviously, Daniel will be raring to get back into the car as soon as he's physically cleared to race. But the more races that Liam completes, obviously the more data Red Bull has, then they know what he can perform. They already know what Daniel can achieve from previous times, from sim history, and obviously the couple of races he has performed. So, and if Daniel does get back this season, which I obviously hope he does fully recover and can race this season, there's definitely going to be an off-season comparison between Liam and Daniel, because I think Liam has done a brilliant job so far, and it's going to be a tough call, I think, over the winter break when they decide who's going to be taking that seat for next season.
And given there's absolutely no pressure on our shoulders to make a decision like this, I feel like we've got to have a bit of fun with this one and try and make one. But, Obviously, we have seen earlier this season, Lance Stroll had a very similar injury to what Daniel Ricciardo had for a certain degree. And it took him a while before he was able to get up to speed. As we're in the second half of this season, of course, we're getting closer to the end of it. Ricciardo will need a period where he will need to get up to speed again as well. And for me, I often wonder if it's possible contractually. I'm not sure if it is currently, but if you were in a position, Lee, where you could choose to either keep Lawson on for the rest of the season or put Ricciardo back in the car when he's fit and available, what would you do? And we should put the asterisks here that it is a bit premature. We've only seen 2 performances from Lawson, so we don't want to get carried away. But what would you do if you had that choice?
Right now, I would have said that the rest of the season is used as effectively a driver race off. You give Daniel another 2 or 3 races to recover. So you basically it's giving Liam another 3 races, and then Daniel for the rest of the season, and then you're going to compare the data from the time, and then you obviously make your decision from that and give them basically from the coming back from the summer break, they basically got 50-50 on the races, and there you got an informed decision for next year.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree to a certain extent. If it were me making the decision, we know what Daniel Ricciardo is capable of. Even, it was a bit stuttered. We know he's still capable of being able to do okay. In the races he was racing in, I don't think he was too far ahead or behind the level of Tsunoda. I think he was quite close to that. So I think as a stock, we know what Ricciardo would be capable of anyway. So I feel if you're Red Bull and you're making this decision at AlphaTauri on who should be driving that car, I think you've got a perfect opportunity here to give Liam Lawson almost half a season to really demonstrate if he's ready for Formula One, because I think that was always something people had their doubts and reservations over as to how ready Liam Lawson would be to step in Formula One. I think this is the perfect opportunity to find out personally, and I don't really feel that you've got much to lose by keeping him in the car after Ricciardo is fit. Instead of just putting Ricciardo in and he's got a period where he's going to have to get up to speed anyway, because as we saw from Stroll's injury, it's not as simple as just getting back in and cracking on. You need a bit of an adjustment period, and for some reason Lance is still adjusting for whatever reason, I don't know. But yeah, I think you've got nothing to lose by leaving Lawson in the car. At least by the end of the season, you will know if Lawson is definitely ready or if they do want to put Ricciardo back in that car. It's not ideal if you're Daniel Ricciardo in this situation, but in being brutally honest, if you're not going to put Liam Lawson in this car now, when are you going to put him in there, quite frankly? He can't wait around forever, can he?
No. There's always be, as you said, the questions about Liam, and I'm sure Red Bull will be already pouring over data and making a decision about how to handle Daniel's return and Liam. But as I said, I think it's worth them investigating further Liam's performance and see how he does over more races.
Yeah, absolutely. If it was as simple as monitoring the gap between the 2 teammates when they're a bit more experienced and up to speed, which I think Lawson, to a degree, is much more than he was last weekend, and the gulf was massive, like we have seen other teams on the grid this season, then fair enough. But Lawson's, as I said, if he's a tenth and a half off a Tsunoda on ultimate pace and is finishing P13 in a car that is struggling from race to race, I don't really see why you can't give him the opportunity. And if you took him out of the car for Singapore and put Ricciardo back in, I don't think you've given the guy anywhere near enough time to argue his case when there's an opportunity to give him that. So we'll have to see. Those are my 2 cents on it, and of course yours as well, Lee. Let us know in the comments, guys. What would you do? Would you put Lawson in for the rest of the season or put Ricciardo back in as soon as he's fit? Let us know. Quick one before we sign off on Alpine. Dizzying heights in Zandvoort for Pierre Gasly. Obviously, Ocon had some pace but wasn't able to get the luck. But obviously, Alpine getting a podium in Zandvoort. Great result for them with Gasly finishing in the top 3. But this weekend couldn't be further away from that. They were absolutely dismal in the race. Obviously, Ocon never finished it. Both of them out in Q1. Probably the biggest surprise this weekend, in my opinion, Lee, is Alpine were just so slow at Monza. I was a bit surprised to see how much they struggled.
Yeah, obviously, the Monza is known as temple of speed, and obviously doesn't suit draggy cars. It suits cars, obviously, that have a good top speed. And it seems the Alpine don't seem to have a very good top speed, and seem to be quite draggy. So not great for Monza in either way.
Yeah, it's a very strange one for them. We didn't see much of them either. There was a moment where the two of them come quite close together on the track. Ocon obviously had some reliability issues that took him out of the race. But yeah, after a performance like that in Zandvoort, I think Alpine would have expected much more. But very worrying that they struggled so much. Although it was a circuit that was quite unique to certain characteristics, so maybe Alpine would be much more competitive when we get to Singapore in a couple of weeks' time. But I think that's all we've got time for in this episode, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, let us know your thoughts in the comments for this Italian Grand Prix, and of course, the topics that we've discussed in a bit more detail. Let us know your thoughts. Always intrigued to hear the conversation and see the conversations, of course, and what you guys have to say. Of course, don't forget to follow us on social media. Like the video if you enjoyed it on YouTube. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review if you're listening to us on your favourite podcasting platform. But all that's left to say after the Italian Grand Prix, guys, is thanks for tuning in as always. Please stay safe, and we will see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And remember, as always, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1. Take care.
Goodbye.